We are continuing on in our series. I feel claustrophobic up here today, but it's all right. We're continuing on in our series entitled David, After God's Heart, the life of David. This particular sermon, as I go through it, man, I've been chewing on this and chewing on it and chewing on it and chewing on it, knowing it was coming. And I'll tell you, it was really a thing of, okay, God, what is it that you want me to say? What is it that you want me to say? And there's an image that just kept coming back over and over and over again. And that image was the image of a drink offering. How many of you have ever heard of a drink offering? Have you ever heard of that before? Maybe in your Bible reading, something like that, you've heard of that imagery before. And the first recorded drink offering that we have was a man by the name of Jacob. Jacob was the son of Isaac, and Isaac was the son of a famous guy by the name of Abraham. And so Abraham was chosen by God and said, out of you is going to be a great nation, and the world is going to be blessed, and those who bless you I will bless, those who curse you I will curse. And so this is the picture, okay? And so Abraham had the son Isaac, the sacrificial one. It kind of what almost turned out to be. But he lived and he had a couple more kids, Jacob and Esau. Well, Jacob's name eventually would turn to a famous name by the name of Israel. Jacob's name would eventually become Israel. And on the anniversary of that, when that event took place, when God met with Jacob and changed his name to Israel, Jacob's response back to God was one in which he says, I'm going to build a pillar to God. And so he takes some stones and he puts them all into a column, and he builds the pillar, and he dedicates this pillar to God. And eventually that place where he built that pillar would become known as Bethel, the place where he met God. And on that pillar, what the text says is, it says he took and he poured a drink offering over the pillar. Now, we don't know exactly what it was, whether it was water, whether it was wine, whether it was oil, whatever it was. And so he takes his pillar, and there he says, God, you have done so much for me. Even though this water is mine, or whatever this liquid is mine, even though I could be drinking it right now, I'm going to give it back to you in the form of a drink offering. And so he pours it on the pillar as it washes down over this thing. That drink offering imagery would carry on, actually, throughout the sacrificial system. And so they had rules set up about how when you offered a sacrifice on the altar, you would take a drink offering. And so sometimes you had to go with this amount, and then other offerings went with a bigger amount, and you would take and you would offer it on your sacrifice as you're there. And it was the imagery was that when you took that drink and you poured it on the sacrifice as it went up, the aroma supposedly went up to God, and God was pleased with the worship. It was something that I had, and I'm giving it to you, God. And what happens when you take water or take something and you pour it out on something? Guess what? You don't have it anymore, do you? And that was the point. That's the point, because it was something that I had, and I give it to you, God. And there are times when it's something that I have that seems rather small, and then there are times where it's something that I have that may seem very great. But the imagery is still there. I have it, and I'm giving it to you, God, in something that I can't get back again. And that's the picture of what we have this morning when it comes to David, when it comes to the situation that we come to in 2 Samuel chapter 23. 2 Samuel chapter 23, if you want to turn there, please. We've been marching through Samuel as we've been going and learning all about David. And here we come. Really, even though it's right near the end of his life, what we read about in 2 Samuel 23, and we're going to be spending a couple weeks where it's almost like an appendix at the end of the book. We're actually, today, we're going back in David's life. If you remember, if you've been around here for a little while, we've been talking about David for a while now. I think this is week 16 of this sermon series. Mine most times don't go that long. But in this one, we're going back to a place by the name of the Caves of Adullam. Does anybody remember the Caves of Adullam? If you remember there, we talked about that. Actually, I had the privilege of visiting the Caves of Adullam when we were in Israel a few years ago. And we were able to crawl through these caves. And there, it's like almost like a honeycomb underneath the ground. And you got all these little channels and stuff that you can crawl through. Some of them are only about as big as me as you're going up and down and around, and you get these little open areas. This was a very important place because if you were on the run from somebody, you could definitely hide out here. When you look, it's just flat area above with some scrub brush or something, but underneath you have all these rooms and holes and stuff. It was very, very fascinating. But so we're going back in time, and David is recounting here at the end of his life, and he's recounting back, and actually the writer of 2 Samuel was recounting back at some things that happened. And this particular event was something we had not read about. But the reason why we get to it now is because he's talking about these guys by the name of David's mighty men. David's mighty men. So if you're there in 2 Samuel chapter 23, this is what it says. These are the names of David's mighty men. We're going to call this guy Josh, okay, because I can't say his name. So we're going to call him Josh. Josh was a Tachmonite, was chief of the three. He raised his spear against 800 men, whom he killed in one encounter. Next to him was Eleazar, son of Dodai, the Ahohite. As one of the three mighty men, he was with David when they taunted the Philistines, gathered at Pasdamim for battle. Then the men of Israel retreated, but he stood his ground and he struck down the Philistines till his hand grew tired and froze to the sword. The Lord brought about a great victory that day. The troops returned to Eleazar, but only to strip the dead. Next to him was Shammah, son of Agi the Hararite. When the Philistines banded together at a place where there was a field full of lentils, Israel's troops fled from them. But Shammah took a stand in the middle of the field. He defended it and struck the Philistines down, and the Lord brought about a great victory. We could go on down, verse 18, verse 20. We read about more of these guys, these specific men who were called David's mighty men. In fact, as we go to the end of the chapter, we can see the list, and it's about 30, if you count them all up, even though they were called the 30, it's the total about 37 people. And these men were misfits. They were renegades. They were somewhat outlaws, I guess you'd say, because they joined David when he was here at the caves of Adullam. So if we go back in time, we remember that David was on the run from Saul. Not only was he on the run from Saul, but he was on the run from the Philistines because the Philistines wanted him dead because he had been killing some of their people. And Saul wanted him dead because Saul thought that he wanted the throne. And so he had all these people against him, and David's hiding out, and he feels like the world is crashing in on him. And he feels alone, and he feels separated from everybody, out and hiding. And even though God had promised that someday you're going to have the throne, someday you're going to be the king, it seemed like that was never going to happen because he was wondering if he was going to live tomorrow. And so what does God do? God brings his family. 1 Samuel 22 tells us that. But not only does he bring his family, but he brings along these men. And the Bible tells us these men numbered about 400. 400 men decided to join David that day there at the caves of Adullam. And they came along, and these guys were in debt. They were on the run from whatever government they were a part of. They were discouraged. They were not wanted people. And so sure enough, they came to David, and they formed this band. I guess it was the original Band of Brothers. As these guys came together, and even though they were unwanted by everybody else, they all wanted each other. And the text goes to great lengths. You know, it is really interesting how so often what's portrayed in culture nowadays is that it seems like the culture wants men to be soft. We need to be soft, and we need to be sensitive, and we need to have all of our characteristics should just be brought down. And yet the Bible doesn't seem to have any problem portraying men as, yes, we need soft and we need sensitive men, but we also need tough men. And one of the things that the Bible talks about in here is one of these guys, if you look down here in verse 20, Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, was a valiant fighter from Kabzeel who performed great exploits. He struck down 2 of Moab's best men. He also went down into a pit on a snowy day and killed a lion. Now, I wouldn't want to go into a pit with a lion on a non-snowy day. But the text seems to say, hey, this was so good, he went on a snowy day and went and killed the lion. And he struck down a huge Egyptian. Although the Egyptian had a spear in his hand, Benaiah went against him with a club. He snatched the spear from the Egyptian's hand and killed him with his own spear. I'll take that, thank you very much. And now you're dead. Such were the exploits of Benaiah, son of Jehoiada. If we were to go through this list, we probably can see time and again, these guys were tough as nails. These guys they had obviously great physical talent and bravery and whatever it was. But I find it really interesting that these men wanted to follow David. What does that really tell you about David? I mean, think about it. If the quarterback of the team, of the football team, is scared to death to take a hit, what do you think that's going to say to the men around him? Are they going to want to be tough like him? No. They're going to be scared to death as well, and they're not going to want to be following after this guy. But when the quarterback says, I'm willing to take a hit, it inspires the rest of the team. And I think in this particular case, courage inspired bravery. And so these guys, as they were going along, we read about something they did, and that's going to be the subject of the sermon this morning. Verse 13. During harvest time, 3 of the 30 chief men came down to David at the cave of Adullam, while a band of Philistines was encamped in the valley of Rephaim. At that time, David was in the stronghold, and the Philistine garrison was at Bethlehem. David longed for water and said, "Oh, that someone would get me a drink of water from the well near the gate of Bethlehem." So the 3 mighty men broke through the Philistine lines, drew water from the well near the gate of Bethlehem, and carried it back to David. But he refused to drink it. Instead, he poured it out before the Lord. "Far be it from me, O Lord, to do this," he said. "Is it not the blood of men who went at the risk of their lives?" And David would not drink it. Such were the exploits of the 3 mighty men. One of the things that as I'm reading this passage, and I tried to read it like this was my very first time reading it again. I've read this many, many times, but I tried to go back and say, okay, if I were first time reading this, what would be some of the things that would cross my mind? Well, the first thought I had was, what do you think these men think? You know, they go and they break through the lines, and sure enough, they bring this water back to David, and they're like, "David, here is your water." Get rid of that stuff. "We risked our life for you, and that's what you think of our sacrifice?" Or what would you think of David? You know, I wonder what went through David's mind. "Man, that water looks real good right now. What have I done? My water's gone. There it was. I had it right in front of me, and now it's all gone." I don't think either one of those really took place, actually. Because I really think that what this does is it reflects the heart of David, who I believe truly was a man after God's own heart. And so we're going to dive in a little bit, dig into it, and I hope it's going to pull it all together for you. Really the theme of my message this morning from 2 Samuel 23, 8 through 17 is this. You and I think, have a responsibility. If we say, I want my heart to be after you, God, then one of the things that I'm going to have to do is get to a place in which I say, I'm willing to pour out my wants. Now, if you notice, there's quotes around the word wants. Okay? I want you to notice this. Because I think if we look at this and we don't see this properly, we're going to think that if something good happens to us, that we got to get rid of it. In other words, God desires for us to be miserable. He wants us to be always giving things back as if God is this greedy God who wants all of our stuff and we just have to be miserable back over here. I don't think that's the case at all. What I see here is, I see David. So let's look at our passage just a little bit. He says, okay, so David came down to the cave of Adullam. Verse 14, it says, at that time David was in the stronghold. Now what is it that makes a stronghold a stronghold? It's a place where your enemy is going to have a real hard time getting you, correct? Real hard time getting you. Now, if you don't have basic necessities in your stronghold, what chance do you have of being able to keep the enemy away for a long time? if you need something as basic as water, and you have to keep leaving the stronghold to go get it, every time you leave the stronghold to go get your water, what does that put you? It makes you very vulnerable, doesn't it? I don't think that David was sitting in the stronghold going, I could sure use a drink of water right now. I don't think that was it at all. I think David was sitting in there going, I could sure use a drink of that water. Now you guys know what I'm talking about when I say that water. All of us have a reference point for water, don't we? How many of you are on a well? Okay, for those of you who are on a well, how many of you like to get a drink out of the drinking fountain when we used to be able to do this here at Frontline Bible Church? Okay? When you come and you're on a well and you have the taste of your well, remember it tastes just like rotten eggs and sulfur. Remember that taste that you love so much about your well? Shows you my experience of the well, okay? There are some wells that are really good, some wells that are not, but you get used to your water. And so those of you who grew up maybe down in Dorr, you have your favorite water, the Dorr water, don't you? And you go somewhere else and you're like, oh, there's nothing like Dorr water. Or then you go to another place and you're like, oh man, there's nothing like Wyoming water or whatever else. Or there's nothing like that Ice Mountain water that I get to drink out of my bottle. We all have maybe our favorite waters. And I think that's what David was. He's thinking back to maybe a better time. I mean, think about it. He's on the run. He leaves Bethlehem because that's where he grew up. I mean, that's where so many of his childhood memories were. I'll guarantee he went to that well many times with his sheep, and he's there and he gets that cup out and he pulls it. Oh, it's so cold. It's so refreshing, and he did it. And he's sitting there longing back for the day when life was better. When he wasn't being chased around all over the place. When he didn't wonder where his next battle was going to come or whatever else. And he longed for that day. I think that's something for us. I think we also have the same thing. We go to these places where we long for the day where we could go back to a better time. An easier time. Oh, do you remember when? Or maybe we look ahead to the future where we say, oh my goodness, if only I could have this. If only my life could be like this. To put it in modern day terms, if only I could get that promotion. Oh, if only I could actually find a date. Oh, if only my spouse would improve in this way. Oh, if only. And we go through this list and we have all these things. But at the end of the day, it's not stuff that we need most of the time. These are the things that we're sitting there just wishing we had more of. And so I'll ask you, what are some of the wants that you have in your life? Maybe it's some of those things right now. Like I said, you have water. You have a job, or you have a good life, or you have the things that you do. But you're thinking to yourself, if only I had that. If only it was this. If only it was that. And we're sitting there and we're kind of discontent a little bit. And so we think to ourselves, if I could only have this, oh, it would be so satisfying. That's the question. Because I think what we're going to read from David and see from David is what he ended up doing was he wanted that water from Bethlehem's well so bad. But when God finally gave it to him, and potentially at great cost, he takes his want and he says, God, I'm going to offer it back to you. Now I realize if I offer it back to you, I don't have it anymore. But God, you are worthy of my worship. You're worthy of my praise. You're worthy of everything in my life. And I could sit here and think and think and think and think, but I'm going to offer it. I'm going to pour it out back to you. And I hope that as we go through this sermon, I hope that some of this begins to click a little bit. Like, okay, what are you doing with your wants? What are you doing in terms of this? And are you willing to actually say, God, I give it back? And so with that, we're going to get to our first lesson. Here's the first lesson. Pouring out my wants can save lives. Now, pouring out my wants can save lives. Okay, so here's the thing. it says there, okay, so these guys come down, and David says, he says, oh man, oh, that someone would get me a drink of water from the well near the gate of Bethlehem. Have you ever said something in the presence of somebody, hoping they were listening? Oh, if only somebody would get me the remote that's across the room right now. Oh, if only. Oh, yes, if only. Oh, if only we could have tacos tonight. Oh, if only. I don't know. I don't know if David was just sitting there, like on the, on the rock over there, and he's just chilling, thinking to himself, or whether there's all these men around. But regardless of whatever it was, these men hear David's longing. Oh, that I could just have some water from the well. And you can just picture. I mean, these guys are tough guys, right? And they turn to each other and they're like, you thinking what I'm thinking? Yeah, I'm thinking what you're thinking. Let's go. Let's go do it. So, how far is it from the cave of Adullam to Bethlehem? Oh, it's about 10 miles. It's about 10 miles. So what do? They go down. I'm envisioning they're not probably taking swords going, bring it out. Come on, Philistines, let's take them. They're 3 guys. I'm thinking it's kind of guerrilla warfare. I don't know how many Philistines died in the process. I'm guessing probably a couple. But they sneaked their way all the way to the well. This is Philistine-controlled territory. And they go down and they sneak over there, and you can just picture bringing it up, filling up the skin, going, oh, David's going to be so happy for this. Oh, he is going to be so happy. Why did they do this? Was it because they had to? No. The reason why they did this is because they thought the world of their king. They thought the world of their king. So what do? Think the world of the king, and so they sneak around 10 miles there, 10 miles back. They come back and they're like, David, we got it for you. Here is your water, the water you've just been talking about and dreaming about. And you can just picture David going, no way. No way. It's my water. It's my Bethlehem water. You can just picture it. But what he ends up saying is he pours it out, and he says this. Far be it from me, O Lord, to do this, he said. Is it not the blood of men who went at the risk of their lives? You see, when David saw the water from Bethlehem, when David looked at this water, do you know what he saw? He didn't see his Bethlehem water. He looked at his water and he saw the blood of his men that could have been lost had this not gone well. Can you just imagine what it would have been like if David would have gotten word? As David says, hey, whatever happened to those 3 guys? I mean, they were just here. Where'd they go? David, I want to tell you something. They got killed. How'd they get killed? They were trying to bring you some water. You know, you made a comment, probably just a passing comment. Boy, if only I could have some water. And they went down to do it, and all 3 of them got killed. How do you think David would have felt at that moment? Was that comment worth it? Let me bring it into modern day terms a little bit. How often do we sometimes as parents, do we sometimes as bosses, do we sometimes as authority figures, whatever else, make comments that oftentimes could be potentially what I would say careless? We didn't make them hoping that the kids would think this or hoping that our employees would think this or whatever else, but we made a comment, and oftentimes it's because of the love, it's because of the admiration, it's because of the respect, whatever else, that our kids or our employees or whatever will go to great lengths to say, I'm going to do this for you. Now, that's not all bad if it's something that's good. But there have been times, I think, unfortunately, where parents, and let me say fathers especially, where I think fathers have maybe cast this vision that's out there that I will accept you, I will be proud of you, I will do this if. And the kids literally try to kill themselves to get the attention, to get the admiration, to get the respect of their dad. Rather than the dad being careful with his words. He ends up being careless with the words. If only you were a better athlete. If only you were a better student. And I don't think it's just dads. But so often those father wounds can be real. And so oftentimes when we look and we say, the reason why we a lot of times hold these things that we do is because we're sometimes trying to live our lives through our kids. We're sometimes trying to live our lives through the employees, or sometimes trying to do this rather than just being able to accept them for who they are. And so sometimes I have to look at my own life and say, okay, why do I do the things that I do? Why do I say the things that I do? Why do I have the expectations that I do? Is it because I'm trying to impress the next person? Is it because I'm trying to be well-known or famous or whatever else? Or would it be better if I simply just poured out my own desires? I poured out my wants and I gave them to you, God. I can guarantee if those men would have died, David would have looked at his comments and said, oh, I wish I would have never said that. And I guess my question then for you is, are there things that you want? Maybe you want children so bad. You want children so bad that you can't appreciate even your spouse, even though they can't have kids. And maybe some of the comments that you say brings the others down. I know in my own life, we had my son. We ended up being able to adopt my daughter. We wouldn't have had that were it not for infertility stuff. We wanted more kids. At least I wanted more kids. I think my wife wanted more kids. We wanted more kids, but oftentimes it can be very easy to look and say, yeah, these are the kids that we never had, or this is what happens, and forget to appreciate those we do have. And so sometimes we just have to pour out our wants and say, God, I give it back to you. Yes, I know I wanted this. Yes, I know I wanted that. Yes, I know I wanted these things, but I give it back. Because what I don't want to do is I don't want to demean the lives of those who are around me, because there are those who are listening, who are carefully hearing what I'm saying. And I need to make sure I'm not bringing a life down in the process. Pouring out our wants can actually save lives. Here's another lesson. Pouring out my wants can be inspiring. Pouring out my wants can be inspiring. When I think of David and I think of these men broke through the lines just to get some water, just to bring it back for David to take the water and pour it out. And as I said, I don't think the men were sitting there open mouth aghast. He just poured out the water we risked our life for. I think what happened was they recognized what was happening. And they realized that David, because he was a man after God's own heart, when he took that priceless water and he pours it out to God, I think it became an inspiration of the men. In fact, we see a New Testament example of this. You don't have to turn there, but I'll tell you the story. If you remember, Jesus was in Bethany and there was a woman who came in and she had a very expensive bottle of perfume. And she brings in this very expensive bottle of perfume. It was in Matthew chapter 26. She brings in the bottle of perfume, and what does she do? She opens the bottle, and what does she do? She pours it on Jesus' head. And the disciples are going, what is she doing? That stuff could have been sold for a fortune, and we could have had money in the coffers. Judas especially was thinking that. We could have had all this stuff and wasting it over his head. And what was Jesus' response back to her? He says this. He says, when she poured this perfume on my body, she did it to prepare me for burial. I tell you the truth, wherever this gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. Jesus says that this is going to get written down, okay? It's going to be written down, and when you talk about the gospel, and you talk about Jesus, and you talk about the things that happened in his life, it's going to be recorded in the Bible for 2,000 plus years, and we still talk about that lady today. What would have happened if she would have simply taken the perfume, sold it, put it in the coffers, and the money would have been given away? Who knows? What would have happened if David would have simply taken the water from that well in Bethlehem and goes, glug, 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 glug. Oh, that was delicious. Thanks, guys. Nothing would have happened. Instead, we still talk about it to this day. And so I'll ask you, what are some of the wants that you have in your life? What are some of the things that maybe you're holding on to? Some of the dreams and the aspirations or whatever it is. And what would happen if you were willing to say, not my will, but yours be done, God? God, yes, I desperately want to be married. I pour it out to you, not my will, but yours. Yes, God, I desperately want to have children. Yes, God, I desperately want to have more children. Yes, I desperately want a job. I desperately want to retire. Yes, I want these things. I pour it out to you. Who may hear of it? Who may think this? And who may you come in contact with that could be very inspired by your willingness to actually pour it out and not have it anymore? It can be inspiring. I want to get to this last one. Pouring out my wants can be worship. Pouring out my wants can be worship. If David would have taken the water, drunk the water, what he would have been in essence saying is he's saying, I am worthy of the sacrifice of these men. These men risked their lives for me and I'm worthy of it. I think because David was a man after God's own heart, he realized, he's like, no, that gift was far too high. I am not worthy of the sacrifice of these men to me, and therefore, it's not about me. In fact, it's interesting that in the text he says, far be it from me, O Lord, to do this. So here's the men. David, what do you think? Here's the water. Here's the water. And he doesn't say, hey, far be it from me, guys, to do this. What does he say? He says, far be it from me, O Lord, to do this. I dump it out. You see, when we pour out our wants, I don't pour out my wants, and I mean pour it out like the sacrifice. I don't pour it out for the sake of my wife, even though she may benefit. I don't pour out my wants for the sake of my kids, even though they may benefit. I don't pour it out for the sake of others, even though they may benefit. The reason why I do this is because I do it out of worship for God. I do it out of worship for God. It's interesting as we read through and we see this. We see Jesus. In fact, I want you to turn there, Luke chapter 22. Luke chapter 22. Luke chapter 22 there in verse 20. As you're getting there, Jesus, it was the Last Supper, and he takes the bread and he breaks and he says, do this in remembrance of me. And then he takes the cup. And when he takes the cup, he says, in the same way after the supper, he took the cup saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. Here it is, which is poured out for you. What did it cost Jesus to pour out his blood for you and for me? If you remember the scene from the crucifixion, what was it that poured out? If you remember, what did they do? They took the spear, and they stuck it in his side. And what does it say? It says, blood and water poured out. You see, it cost Jesus his life. But the thing was, when Jesus went to the Garden of Gethsemane, where he was praying, if you remember down here, in verse 42 of Luke 22, Father, if you are willing, take this cup, the cup of the suffering, the cup of judgment here. Take this cup from me, yet not my will but yours be done. You see, I believe Christ is our example of what it looks like to pour out our wants. Jesus in that moment is like, God, if it's possible, if there's another way, if I'd be willing to entertain it. You know, going to the cross doesn't sound like a whole lot of fun right now. I'm willing to do it for you, but if it's possible, take it away. But you know what? Hey, at the end of the day, not my will but yours be done. You know, so often we think of worship as that which we do from 1025 to 1040 on Sunday mornings when we sing. That's worship, right? Well, yes, it technically could be. But so is when I take my wants and I go to God and I say, God, I want to be married. I pour it out for you. I worship you with my relationships. God, I really want more kids. I pour it out. I worship you in my family. God, I want this. I want that job. I pour it out. I worship you with my job. I worship you. I'm pouring it out, and I'm thanking you, God, in the process. I read a quote, and I thought it was really good. Think about this. Why do you worship God? Why do you worship God? Why do I worship God? As I was working through this, in fact, the book came from this book called Removing the I from Life, the Dethroning of King Me. When I saw King Me, I thought, that's me. Removing the I from life. One of the things that he says in the book is, why do you worship God? And he had just gone through talking about all the reasons why God is so worthy of our worship, all the things out of creation, all the things that he has done, all the things that he has made. And I read through the section going, well, that's why I worship God. I worship God because of who he is and all that he has done. That's why I worship God. And then he gave the next question. And I'm like, ouch. If God chose not to give you another blessing for the rest of your life, would you still worship him? Out of all the things that God has done, God has blessed you, and he's done all these sort of things. And so we sit here on Sunday morning with every reason to praise God, correct? But if God never blessed you again, would you still worship him? When I sit there and I pour out and I say, God, yes, I offer you my family. And who knows, maybe my family will be taken away. I sure hope not. But you know what? I give you my family. You're worthy of my worship. I pour it out. I pour out my job. I pour out my future. I pour out my reputation. I pour out whatever it is that I have. I pour it out to you. Why? Because I worship you. Because you deserve it. Pouring out my wants can save lives. Pouring out my wants can be inspiring. Pouring out my wants can be worship. And so my question is, are your wants getting in the way of your worship today? Are you firmly on your throne as King Me? And so as we wrap it up today, I ask you, are you willing to be like David, a man after God's heart? Are you willing to be like David who says, you know what, God, yes, I have it, and I could drink this, and I could do this, and I could hold on to this, but instead, because of who you are and because how much I love you, I give it back. I pour it out. And so the question as we wrap it up, as you pursue the heart of God, what wants can you pour out today? What wants can you pour out today? Why? Because you have to? No. But because you get to. In honor of Jesus Christ and all that he's done for you. And let it be said of us at Frontline Bible Church that we are a people who's not just in it for ourselves. Oh yeah, we're willing to trust God as long as we can keep the lights on here and as long as we can grow the things that we do and I grow the people and have all the wonderful ministries and everything. Oh yes, we'll follow you. But what would happen if our freedoms were taken away? Would we still worship God? What would happen if we didn't have all these nice things? Would we still worship God? As you and I pursue the heart of God, let it be said of us as Frontline that we are willing to pour it all out for him because he alone is worthy. Let's close in prayer. Lord, I want to thank you for today. I thank you for your word that is powerful. Lord, I thank you for the example of a guy like David. You know, at first as I read this, like I said, I struggled. I don't think you're telling us that we can't have nice things. I don't think you're telling us that we just, if something good comes along, we got to get rid of it because you're not going to be happy. No, I think David sets that example for us of what it means to surrender the things that we want. Maybe sometimes those things that we put out there before others and maybe sometimes at great cost. May we be willing to be people who trust you more, who wait on you more, who are willing to submit ourselves and our desires and our wants to you. God, I pray for hearts, that we would be about your heart, as David was after your heart. Not perfectly, but certainly intentionally. And so, Lord, thank you for today. I thank you for all the things you do for us and those And thank you for all that you can be for us, even here at Frontline. In Jesus' name we pray. And all those in agreement said, amen.